How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Kuf Chaf, Daf 120 of Masechta Chullin. Very exciting. We're mamish moving through Masechta Chullin. I think this means we have roughly 3 weeks left of Masechta Chullin. Unbelievable. Today we got kind of a big daf. It's not particularly difficult. I think the most difficult part is probably the first section, which isn't that difficult in my opinion. I don't know. It's not the easiest stuff. It's not the hardest stuff. It kind of moves, but it's kind of big too, right? Usually, as a rule of thumb, there's lots of sections to it, so it's going to be a big one. Here, there are 5 sections. So, anyways, the first section of the daf, we discuss hair as a handle or as a guard. Sheesh. Yeah, hair as either a yad or as a shomer. Anyways, we'll discuss that. Again, it's not the easiest. It's not so hard, but it's what do you want me to tell you? It's a or varotev. It's tumintara. Then we move on to the rotev. Up until now, I guess if you could say we've been discussing the or, the hide, we move on to the rotev. The next item in the Mishnah, that's a brief discussion. We then move on. If you remember, the third item in the Mishnah was kippah. I think we'll discuss what kippah is. And then that kind of segues into the bigger sections of the daf, which are liquified issurs. So if you have something like chelev that you liquify and drink, yichayev, or we're going to discuss that, and that kind of segues into biccurim and trume. Even we get to orla shtickle at the end. Anyways, so that's what we have in store for today's daf. Today's Friday. This week's Sedra is Parshas Kisavo, which discusses the biccurim. So we'll have the opportunity to learn a little bit about biccurim, mamash, and Erev Shabbos Parshas Kisavo. So I think this should be a great daf. Come join me. Let's have a great time studying daf Kuf Chaf, daf 120 of Masechta Chullin. Friends, we begin on daf Kuf Yud Tes Omid Beis. About 6 or 7 lines before it even gets wide. Okay, so we have some work to do on Daf Kuf Yud Tes Amud Beis, where the Gemara says Gufe Shnei Atzomis Ve'alein Shnei Chatzoy Zeisim. If you remember, we discussed yesterday the scenario where you had 2 human chops. There are bones, and on each bone there was half a zayis of human flesh, and you had 2 of them next to each other. The flesh was outside of the house, but the bones extended inside of the house, and the Tanakama had said that the house was tamei as an oel hames on account of essentially the yados, the bones as serving as a yad to convey tuma into the tuma into the house, right? The flesh of the mace to treat it as though it's in the house, and there's tumas oil. So again, gufa shnei atzomis, you have these 2 human chops, valein shnei chatzoy zeisim, that have each human chop has a half a zayis on it. Vichnis roshein shnayim la boyis, and the 2 bone ends, the 2 handle ends, were inside of the house. Now the meat was outside of the house. Ve'habayis ma'ahil alehen, and the yados are in the house, and the house is an ohel, for a tent for the yados. Habayis tamei, so the house is tamei with tumas ha'oel. Yehuda ben Nekusa Omer. Yehuda ben Nekusa argues on the Tanakam and says, Mishum Reb Yaakov, the name of Reb Yaakov, Eyach Shnei Atzomis Mitzdarf from the Kazayis. How can these 2 human chops join together to create a Kazayis? They cannot, and therefore there is no tumas ha'oel. Rish Lakish now says Rish Lakish, he comments about this brisa. Loishanu ela etzem davayad. We're specifically talking in the brisa about the bones of the human chop. That we have these 2 human chops, and we're discussing their bone being a yad to convey tuma avol. Nima, if we're talking about a hair, so instead of a bone, it's kind of a funny, peculiar concept, but if you have the meat, and I guess some hide, and on the hide there's a hair, and that hair, I guess, extends into the house, it would not be considered a yad. Aval nima lo avi yad. That would not be considered a yad. If the hair extends into the house would be tor. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, afilu nima nami havya yad. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan, it says even a hair can be considered a yad, and I think what that means is that essentially you have a hair, I guess, extending into the house, or maybe part of the hide that's in the house, but not the flesh. It would be considered a handle. Okay, fine. Well, if it was with the hide, then the hide maybe could be considered a shomer. Anyways, fine. Eisvei, Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan asks a kasha to Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan, who says that the hair is a handle, asks a question of Rish Lakish, who says that the hair is not a handle. We have a Mishnah Daf Kuf Chaf Dalid that says, or sheyesh olav kazayis buser, that if you have hide and attached to the hide is a kazayis of flesh, hanogea bitziv ayotze mimenu, somebody who touches a thread of like flesh of meat that's extending from the kazayis, uve saira or ive shekenegdo, or a hair that is opposite the kazayis of flesh, tameh, is tameh. So we see that we have a hair being right. It says that you have a kazayis of flesh, and we're talking here about tumas nevela. Okay, so we're talking about a nevela, and there's a kazayis of meat from a nevela, and then there is hide on it, and there is a hair. Right, so a nugeh b'tziva yotzei. So if there's like a thread of flesh that you touch, or ubesayir shekenegdo, or next, right, opposite the kazayis of flesh, there is hide, and on that hide there is a hair. If you touch that hair, so you will be tameh as well. My lab mishum yad. So Rabbi Yochanan wants to argue, what does it mean that you're tameh if you touch that hair? Well, the hair is a yad, and it's going to convey tumas nevela to you. Lo, Rish Lakish would answer, mishum shomer. No, the hair is not a yad, it is a shomer, and that's why you are tameh if you touch it. Mi'ika shomer, agabi shomer. But wouldn't that be a shomer on top of a shomer? I.e., you have the flesh. The shomer for the flesh is the hide, and you're telling me that then the hair that's on top of the hide is a shomer, but when the hide is a shomer, the hair on top of the hide would then be a shomer on top of a shomer. Chalchuli mechalchel. To which Rish Lakish would answer, no, it's not a problem because the hair goes through the hide into the meat, right? So it's not like there's flesh and then hide, and on top of the hide there's hair. The hair penetrates through the hide into the meat, and basically it is directly connected to the meat. Maskeflor of Acha. Yaakov asked an interesting question. But if that's the case, that you're telling me that animal hairs puncture through the hide and go into the meat, well, then that means that by definition, inherently, the hides have these little hair-sized holes in them, because the hides, the hair completely penetrate the hides. Well, then, when you're writing tefillin, you're basically writing tefillin on a perforated hide, which would mean that the writing would be incomplete. It would have all of the letters would have holes in them, essentially. So ishtamitze ad amar the amar marava but Ravacha bar Yaakov, it slipped his mind that which to say in Eretz Yisrael konekav shadio over alab, that if there's a microscopic hole in the parchment, and it's so small that the ink just goes right over it, and you can't even see that there's a hole there. So Eino Nekeb is not considered a hole. So therefore, there is no issue with that little hole. Okay, so what have we seen so far? We've seen that there is a machlekes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish with regard to a hair. Right? If you have a hair connected to say you have meat and then hide and then hair. So Rish Lakish says it is not a yad. Rabbi Yochanan says it is a yad. Rabbi Yochanan tries to bring a raya from the Mishnah Daf Kuf Chav Dalid that talks about tumas nevela, a kazayis with some hide and then some hair, and if you touch the hair, you are tameh. Rabbi Yochanan wants to argue because the hair is a yad. Rish Lakish says no, it is a shomer. The hair is a shomer, and it punctures right through the flesh, the hide into the flesh. V'baisema, alternatively, kule mishum yad. You know what? You could say that the Mishnah on Daf Kuf Chav Daled is talking about a yad, and even Rish Lakish would agree that the Mishnah on Daf Kuf Chav Daled is talking about a yad. However, it is different than the human chops example. Kidam Reb Illa, it's like Reb Illa. B'maloi, with maloi. We'll explain what that is in a second. Sheben ha-maloim, among the maloims. Hachanami b'nima sheben ha-nimin. Here also, when it comes to the Mishnah Daf Kuf Chav Daled, which we could say, if you touch the hair, you are going to be tamei tumas from tumas nevela, and it is considered a yad. Even Rish Lakish would agree it's a yad. However, it's because it's not just one hair, it's several hairs. There's a difference because one hair is weak. It'll break. If you try to even, pull the meat by the hair, it'll just snap potentially. But several hairs already can create some tug on that, on if you pull it, and it'll stay, and it won't break. So you could say that the Mishnah Daf Kuf Chav Daled about touching the hair and becoming tamei is because it's talking about several hairs and it's considered a yad. So Heicha Itmar to Reb Illa, where did Reb Illa say this thing about maloi, which we haven't explained what they are yet? Aha, it's on the following. The third Mishnah, Masechta Uktzin, maloi shebeshibolim, the maloi of wheat stalks, mitamin umitamin venim mitzdarfin, they are motzi tuma, machnis tuma, they don't join, they're a yad, so they don't join together. Maloi l'maychazi, what are these maloi good for? Amr b'iloi says, "Will I be maloi sheben ha-maloyim?" It's talking about malois among the maloim. What are these malois things? I was thinking about having a slide. I think it's ultimately not strictly necessary, and it's Friday, so I'm in a bit of a rush, so I didn't make one. But essentially, Chava, has anybody ever seen like a stalk of wheat? Wheat is kind of like a grass, and it's kind of like this tall grass, and at the top there's like all these like wheat berries in their current, in their shells, whatever. And at the top where there are all these wheat berries, there's also all these like tentacles, these like grasses that are like, right? You know what I'm talking about? These like like by the top where the berries are, there's all these like tentacles going up this way and up that way. It's probably some kind of a protective thing the way to protect the fruit or something. But anyways, so that's what these maloi things are. These maloi things are these tentacles at the top of the wheat grass, where the wheat stalk, where all the berries are. There's these like tentacles going this way and that way. So there we are talking about them as a yad, and it's not just talking about one tentacle, because that if you pull it, it'll keep breaking out. But if you grab it by multiple of these tentacles, so then that would be considered a yad. So here also we could say that when it comes to the hair, and when we're talking about in Daf Kuf Chav Daled, that touching the hair of the nevela, you can become tamei, because we're not just talking about one hair. Rish Lakish would say one hair is not a yad, it can snap. But if we're talking about multiple hairs is already something that you can grab onto, something that can be considered a yad. So let's read that again. Rav Ibais Ema, I'm backing up a few lines. If you say kul mishum yad, you can say that the Mishnah Daf Kuf Chav Daled is talking about a yad, and that if you touch the hair of this nevela, you become tamei because it's a yad. However, it's not just talking about one hair. Kedam Reb Illa, it's like Reb Illa is talking about b'maloi sheben amaloyim, like these tentacles of the wheat that are among other tentacles, and that's why they could be a yad. Hachanami here also by the Mishnah Daf Kuf Chav Daled b'nima sheben animin. We're not just talking about one hair; we're talking about multiple hairs. Vecha itmar de Reb Illa. Where does Reb Illa talk about these tentacles? Aha, on the following Mishnah Masechta Uktzin, maloi shebeshibolim mitamin umitamin ve'enon mitzdarfin, that these tentacles at the top of the wheat grass are essentially yados. Maloi l'maychazi, how could they be a yad? What good is one of these tentacles? If you try to grab it, it'll break. So Reb Illa, maloi sheben amaloim, it's talking about if you grab multiple tentacles, and then it will be stronger. Lishna achrina amrila, there are those who describe this discussion about the hairs and the multiple hairs and the multiple tentacles in a slightly different way. Hachinami mistavra the mishum shomer, that Rish Lakish says that the hair must be talking about a shomer. Disagadaitech mishum yad nima'achas l'may chazi. Right? Rish Lakish argues that when we're talking about a hair, it must be a shomer rather than a yad, because a hair alone, what good is it'll break. So says the Gemara, well, not necessarily, because it could be Kedam Rabbi Illa, like Rabbi Illa says, but Malay Shaben Amaloim. We could be talking about hair as a yad, just not one single hair, but several hairs that you can grab onto and it will pull right without breaking. Hachanami bit Nima Shaben Animim, just like Rabbi Illa is talking about in Uktzin, about these multiple tentacles. So here also we're talking about multiple hairs. Vecha itmar to Ilai ahad tnan on the Mishnah in Masechta Uktzin hamaloy bashibolim, these tentacles of the wheat, mitamin ve'imitztarfin, they're essentially yados. Maloy lemai chazi, what good is a tentacle? It'll break if you pull it. Omer Reb Ilai be maloy sheben amaloyim, it's talking about tentacles among tentacles, i.e. you're not just grabbing one tentacle, but multiple tentacles, which makes it sturdier, pullier, and a yad. And therefore we could say the same thing about the hairs on Daf Kuf Chadalid, that if you come in contact with multiple hairs of this nevela, it can be mitame as a yad. Okay, just chapt a shlukatim. We're going to go weiter. V'gid amasnila amasnisin. There are those who discuss this same discussion for seemingly like the third time, directly on our Mishnah. Ha'or barota v'akipa v'chulei. That our Mishnah talks about the hide and the gravy and the kippah, which we'll describe soon, but it also mentions atzamos. The Mishnah also mentions bones. Mitzdarfin, l'tamei, tumas ochlin, and that they could be a shomer in order to join together to create a shear of a kebeya for tumas ochlin. Rish Lakish says, Rish Lakish l'shanu ela etzim. He says, Rish Lakish we're talking about bones being a shomer. Dave shomer. Avod nima lo avya shomer, but a hair would not be a shomer, which is different than what he's been saying up until now, because up until now, Rish Lakish has been saying that a hair is a shomer. Now he's saying, no, a hair is not a shomer. Rabbi Yochanan Amar afilu nima nami havya shomer. And here Rabbi Yochanan is the one arguing that a hair would be a shomer. Omle Rish Lakish, the Rabbi Yochanan says, Rish Lakish to Rabbi Yochanan bi'ika shomer agabe shomer. But how can you have a shomer, right? Rabbi Yochanan, you're saying that a hair is a shomer, but the hide is already a shomer, and the hair is a shomer on top of a shomer then, right? A hair on top of a hide is a shomer on top of a shomer. Chachulim b'chalchel. Well, the hair penetrates through the hide into the flesh. Maskeflo ravacha. These all the we've seen this before. Maskeflo ravacha lemiatet tefillin echi kasvinon habin ksivatama veleka. If you're saying that the hair penetrates through the hide, well, then that means that there are these micro holes in the hide. How can we write tefillin on them? There will be micro holes in the writing. It escaped Ravacha bar Yaakov's mind. That was she said in Eretz Yisrael. Kol nekev shadio over olav eno nekev, that any microscopic hole that the ink of the scribe can easily just gloss over and you won't even be able to notice it, is not considered a hole, and it's completely kosher. Ace Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan asks a kasha to Rish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says that the hair would be considered a shomer. Or sheyesh olav kazayis basar from the Mishnah Daf Kuf Chav Dalet, that hide that is connected to a kazayis of nevela. Hanogeh b'tziv ayotzi mimenu, somebody who touches any thread of meat that is emerging from the kazayis of meat. Uvesaira shekenegdo, or one who touches the hair that's connected to the hide that is by the meat. Tame, if you touch that hair, you are tame. My lab mishum shomer. So Rabbi Yochanan wants to say that if you touch the hair, you are tame because the hair is a shomer. Lo mishum nima. Lo mishum yad. No, you are going to be tummy because the hair is a yad. Nima achas ma'chazia. But what are you going to do? One hair, how could it be a yad? If you touch it, if you pull it, it'll break. Kida Amar Reb Illa bin Malosh ben Maloyin, Hachanam bin Nima sheben Animin, just like Reb Illa says in Masechta Uktzin that we're talking about these tentacles among other tentacles of wheat. Here also we're talking about hairs among hairs, so it's not just one hair that's a yad, it is several hairs that come together to be a yad. Ve'echa itmar Reb Illa, where does Reb Illa talk about these tentacles among tentacles? Ahodatnan, that which we learn in Masechta Uktzin, Hamalosh Shabas Shibolin, that these tentacles at the top of the wheat, mitamin ve'im starfin, are essentially yados, maloy l'maychazia. What can you possibly do with one of these tentacles at the top of the wheat? Amar Reb Illa b'malosh ben maloyin, and says Reb Illa, it is talking about not just one tentacle that sure it could break and it won't be a yad, but multiple tentacles that you can hold it by, and that is why it's considered a yad. Okay, fine. So that's how Rish Lakish wants to argue that it's dafka talking about yados rather than shomers. Okay, fine. Givaldig. And now we briefly discuss the gravy, the rotev. V'arotev, my rotev, what's this gravy? Amarava shumana, Rava says it is fat. Abai says, Hu atzmu yitame tumas ochlin. I understand, fat is ochlin. Meaning if the Mishnah is talking about, hide, bones, right, things that are considered shomers, fat is just ochel. So ela chelib dekarish, rather it's some kind of, I think like gelatin or maybe something that like comes out of the meat when it's cooking. It's that, and the krish hard is. It's not lit. It solidifies. My area karish kilo karish nami. To which the Gemara says, who cares if it solidifies or not? Even if it's liquidy, it should also be considered a shomer and be mitzdarif for the kibbeh. The Amr Rish Lakish says, Tzir shal gabe yerek mitzdarif the kikoseves biomaki purim and Yom Kippur. Somebody who needs to eat can only eat up to a large dried dates worth, kikoseves agasa. And included in that amount is even if you have vegetables and there's some kind of briny stuff that emerges from the vegetables, that would be considered part of the shear of the vegetables, even though it is liquefied. So therefore, even when it comes to this, I think like gelatiny kind of stuff that emerges from the meat, so even if it's liquidy, it should still be able to combine. So also mishum yasube daitohu b'choldu miyasva daite. The thing is, when it comes to Yom Kippur, the main concern there is that, right? It says v'nisim es nafshasechem. You have to afflict yourselves. And when it comes to eating, what we're considering is we're going to include in the shear of eating anything that would be the opposite of afflicting oneself. And when it comes to these vegetables, even those brine or whatever that comes from the vegetables would be considered the opposite of afflicting oneself and is therefore included in the share of the koseves. Hacha mishum itztarufeu ikrish mitztarif ilo krish lo mitztarif. Here, when it comes to ochlin, there is a difference between ochlin and mashkin, and we're focused on ochlin over here. Therefore, if this whatever emerged from this meat has solidified, so then we'll consider it as part of the ochel. If it's mashkin, it's not ochel, it's mashkin. It's an anderzach. It's a different thing. Here we're talking about when we're talking about rotev, whatever this stuff that emerges, this brine or something that emerges from the meat and then hardens. So that would be considered a shomer and part of the shear of a kibbeh, but not when it's a mashke, not when it's liquefied. We now move on to the next item in the Mishnah, hakipa. My kippah, what is this kippah? Amar Rabba Pirma. Rabba says it's the sediment at the bottom of the pot. Amar le Abai, hu asmo yitame tumas ochlin. Abai says, but that's just tumas ochlin. It's nothing to do with a shomer. Elo Amar Papa Tavlin. Papa says it is spices. And now we continue and move on to discuss liquefied versions of issurs. Let's see. Tanan Osam, we learned in the Mishnah over there. Where? Unclear. Hikbas Adam, if one heats up blood v'achalo and eats it, or shehimches achelev, or one dissolves chelev v'gamao and gulps it down, drinks it. chayev. In both cases, the heated up blood, the gulped down chaylev chayev. Bishlama hikboy sadam v'chalo. I can understand why if one heats up blood and then eats it, since he heated it up, maybe made some kind of a blood pudding, which is totally a real thing. It's absolutely gross looking. But yeah, you basically take like animal blood and whatever. Let's not get into it, but it's actually a thing. Anyways, so we obviously don't eat that. The Pasuk says, Ki adam hu hanefesh, right? Ki nefesh kol basar damo benafsho hu, or something. Basically, right? The soul of all living things is in the blood, and we already have a soul. The Ramban al Torah says we already have a soul. We don't eat the soul of animals. Rather, that is al mizbeach lechaper. The blood of animals goes in the mizbeach to atone. We do not eat, however, the blood. We have our own soul to deal with. Anyways, so when coming to eat the blood, so I understand why it's also if you heat it up and are machshiv it, and prepare it for food. Ella, himcha is a chelev ugma'o, but if you take chelev and dissolve it and gulp it down, achilik sivei. After all, by chelev it says achila. Now we're going to be working with chelev now. We're going to be working with chametz now. We're going to be working with nevela now, and we're basically going to be talking about in all situations dissolving it down and drinking it in liquid form. We're going to be mentioning the words like achila and nefesh. I'm not going to go and find all the sources and read them directly from the verse, just because it'll create a choppy flow. But these words do, in fact, when the pasuk says achila ksiva be, it really does. Look, I'll just bring you the first example. So it says, right, so achila. It says the same thing by nevela, by chometz. Whatever the Gemara says, it does in fact say. So I'm not actually going to go and look up the psukim because it'll be choppy. So the Gemara says achila ksiva be. It says achila by chelev. You have to eat it, not drink it. But lav achila, you're not consuming it if you're like just dissolving it and gulping it down. Amr shlakish amr krab nefesh. That the pasuk says by nevela, it says v'nichsa nefesh ahi. So it says nefesh, and it says Rashi nefesh mashma kol davar miyashiv daito shaladam. Nefesh, soul, implies anything that relaxes a person, that makes a person feel good. And if you can drink this chelev, so and kind of consume it that way, that is, it says nefesh. Even drinking something down can be kind of relaxing and satisfying. So therefore, even if you drink down chelev, you will be chayiv in that manner as well. The Rabbi says shose to include somebody who drinks chelev in liquid form. So that was chelev. So we see that consuming chelev in liquid form is just as also as consuming it in solid form. Now we are going to see similarly by chometz. Tanya nami gabi chometz ki gavna. We learned similarly by chometz on Paisich. Him chayu ugma'ol, a person who liquefies chometz on Pesach and slurps it up. Im chometz hu anush karis, if it is chometz, is chayev karis for achilas chometz on Pesach. Im matzu ein ad yotzei ba idei chavos Pesach, and if it's matzah, a person cannot satisfy his requirement to consume matzah by drinking it. Bishlam matzah hu he ein ad yotzei ba idei chavos Pesach. I understand why if you liquefy matzah and drink it, it doesn't work. Lechem oni amrach manavai lav. Lechem oni hu. The pasuk says, as we lechem oni. This is a drink, is a smoothie. It's not a bread. Ella, so therefore, it doesn't work for achilas matzah. Ella, im chametzu anush kares, but I don't understand why you would be chayiv kares for consuming chametz in liquid form. Achila ksiva bei. It says achila amr shlakish amr krat nefesh. The Rabbi says shose, but it says by chametz something like v'nichrusa nefesh. So soul. Any way that you satisfy your soul, it could even be via drinking chometz. Gabi nivlas oftar ki gavna, and similarly we learn by the nevela of an of tahor. Of course, when it comes to, for example, I went to a chicken shechita the other week, and one of the birds ended up being a nevela. It was a pasol shchita. So that bird is not automatically mitame. It's nevela, but it's not tame. Only if you were to eat that bird would you become tame. So now we're talking about what if you drink the bird, you liquefy it and drink it. So himcheyu ba'or tame. If you liquefy the bird in fire, then it will be mitame you for consuming nevela, niblas of tahor specifically. Bechama tahor. But if you were to liquefy it in the sun, then it is tahor. B'avinama, we ask, achilak sibbe, why when you liquefy a nivlas of tahor, a bird, are you chayav for, are you going to be tameh? Achila ksiv be. It says achila. So Amar Rish Lakish, Amar Kra, nefesh. Yes, but it says nefesh by nevela as well. Why? What does it say? V'chol nefesh asher tocha nevela. There you go. So it says nefesh there. The Rabbi says ashosa to include drinking. Yachi b'chama nami. So if drinking is an issue, so then why only when you liquefy it on the fire? What if you liquefy it in the sun? B'chama isruche masrach. Well, in the sun it will get all nasty. Okay, fine. Utzricha, we need all three cases. We need to learn about liquefied. What was the first? Chaylev. We need to learn about liquefied chometz, and we need to learn about liquefied nevela. How come we need all three? Because of Achmana Chaylev. Because if the Torah only wrote to us that liquefied chaylev is asur, chometz lo asimine, I would be unable to learn chometz from chaylev shekin lo asur lo shasa chosher, because chaylev is more stringent in the sense that it was always asur, never was mutter, whereas chometz was mutter up until Pesach. Nevela lo asimine, you would be unable to learn out nevela from chaylev shekin anush kares, because chaylev is a chiyuv kares, whereas nevela is not, because of Achmana chometz. And if all the Torah wrote was chometz, chaylev, lo asimine, you'd be unable to learn out chaylev from chometz, shekein lo huter mi chlalo. Chaylev is not across the board asur, as we're going to learn about later on. For example, chaylev of a chaya is permitted. Therefore, that makes chaylev in that sense less stringent than chometz, which there are no exceptions to chametz on Pesach. The nevela lo asimine, you'd be unable to learn out nevela from chametz shekein anush kares, because chametz is more stringent in that it's a chiyuv kares, whereas nevela is not, because of Rachmana ben nevela. And if all the Torah wrote was about liquefied nevela, hanach lo asimine, you'd be unable to learn out chametz and chaylev from nevela shekein mitama, because nevela is stringent in that it is mitame, chaylev and chometz are not. Chadam echad lo ase tesi chadami tarte. To which the Gemara says, okay, so we failed to learn out the other two from writing just one of them. What about if we switch it around a bit and say, well, let's write two examples and learn out the third from the two that are written about? Hey, tesi. Which one do you want to learn about? Maybe don't write anything about liquefying nevela and learn it out from chometz and chaylev. Anush kares. Well, chaylev and chometz, there's a chiyuv kares. Nevela, there's no chiyuv kares. So leave out chometz. Learn it out from nevela and chaylev. Both nevela and chaylev never. Right, we're always asur. Nevela is once it drops dead, it's asur, and chaylev is also inherently asur. So lo lichtav rachmana b'chaylev, don't write by chaylev b'teisi ma'anoch, and learn out chaylev from chometz and nevela. Mal'anach shekein lo utru michlalon. That whereas chaylev is not across the board asur, as we're about to learn out, but chometz on Pesach is totally asur, and chaylev and nevela is totally asur. Tomar be chaylev shutu michlalo, whereas chaylev it is permitted in some scenarios. Mind you, in what scenarios is chaylev permitted? If you can say, well, for example, chaylev is permitted to be put on the mizbeach. Chaylev is part of the emurim that are burnt on the mizbeach for the Rabbanu Shalom. Well, nevela nami ishtarei milikas of legavoa. Yeah, but nevela also, right? The birds in the Beis Hamikdash are not shechted. They are done malika. Malika is not a proper shechita, and yet you put that on the mizbeach as well. Ve'ela chelev chaya lehedget. Rather, let's say that it's talking about the fact that chelev of a chaya is permitted. So chelev of a behema is chelev, and you chayiv kares, but of a chaya, it's completely permitted. Nevela nami shtaroi melika dechatos ha'of l'kohanim. But also when it comes to nevela is also permitted to people, i.e. chatas ha'of, kohanim are allowed to eat it, even though it was melika, it wasn't properly shchited. L'olam chelev chay lehedjot. So really, when we say that chelev is, there are scenarios where it's permitted, it's a reference to the fact that chelev of a chaya is permitted for people to eat. With the kakashilach kohanim, you said okay, but by nevela also it's permitted to kohanim, that by chatas of that there was malika, there wasn't proper shchita. Kohanim shulchan gavua zachu, yes, but the kohanim, they're eating from the Rabbanei Shalom's table, and rules are a little different when you're eating from the Rabbanei Shalom's table. When you're eating from the Rabbanei Shalom's table, you do malika on birds rather than shchita, and that's completely okay. Okay, fine. So we learned about liquefied nevela, about liquefied chametz, liquefied chelev, and we said that by each of those cases, we needed to teach them individually. You would be unable to learn out one from any of the others. But the Tanya, now we're showing the brisa ha tmeim. It says by shrotzim, the extra letter ha tmeim. Lesser tzirun, virotvan, vekifan, to make usur even their brine that emerges from them and any gravy that emerges from them during cooking, vikipa and sediments. Shalai lamali. Why do I need to have a pasuk to teach about these liquids of the shrotzim? Ligomer mehane. Just learn it out from nevela, chametz, and chelev. Tzriche. You need all of the scenarios, the lokas of rachmana, because if the pasuk did not write by shrotzim havamina, I would say dayu lavim and adin lios kanidon. If we wouldn't have this limud from the extra hay by shrotzim, that these liquids are also usur when it comes to shrotzim, and if I learned it out from chametz, chelev, and nevela, well, I would say that mahosam ad diika kazayis acha ad nami ad diika kazayis. That, well, when it comes to nevela, chelev, chametz, we're talking about it's usur b'kazayis. The thing is, when it comes to shrotzim, it's usur b'chadosha, by the smallest amount. So therefore, if we learned it out from the other three examples, I would think kazayis, but we're talking about even the size of a lentil, and therefore shrotzim had to be taught individually to say that it's the halachos of a shrotzim, i.e. the size of a lentil that is asur. Why not only then write the issur achila of these liquid forms by shrotzim and learn out nevela, chametz, chelev from it? Mishum de ikal mifrach, because you can ask, ma'ale shrotzim shekin tumoson b'mashu. You could say, well, shrotzim are more stringent in that they are tamei at the smallest amount, whereas nevela, chelev, chametz, we're talking about a kazayis. And now for the last kind of extended section of the daf, where we talk, among other things, about biccurim and trumet. Detanya, that which we learned in a brisa, hatevel, untied produce, ve'achadash, new produce before the korban ha'omer that we learned about Masechta Menachos is offered on the second day of Pesach. Ve'hektish, anything that you were makdish to the Beis Hamikdash, made holy to the Beis Hamikdash. Ve'ashvius, anything related to Shemitah. Ve'akilayim and kilei akerim kulon, mashkin ayotzimein kimoson, any liquids that come from them are like them and asur. Minalan, how do we know this? If you're going to say, learn it out from nevela, chametz, and chelev, ma lahanach sheken issur abba me'elav havu. When it comes to nevela, chametz, and chelev, those are all examples of isurim that just happen on their own. A nevela, when the animal drops dead, it's nevela. When Pesach comes, there's chametz. When an animal inherently has chelev, and that's that. These are things that you don't do on your own. So tenach heicha de issur ba me'elav. Well, when it comes to all these examples, and most of them, they are examples of issur ba me'elav. Tevel, for example, that's simply the default state of produce that has not yet been tied. Ve'achadash, right? New produce is just by default usur until, right, you didn't do anything to these things. The only exception really is hektish, that you are makdish something made it holy for the Beis Hamikdash. That's the only one that you really had input in. So Tena Checha the issur ba me'elav. Okay, so any of those examples where the issur happened on its own, so we should be able to learn out from Nevela, Chometz, and Chelev, which happened on their own. Hecha delav issur aba me'elav b'nolan. But how do we know about hektish? Right, that if you are makdish, I guess you makdish some food, so then any liquids that come out of it, how do we know that is asur? Gamina mi biccurim. We learn it out from biccurim. Biccurim gufay minalin. How do we know that when it comes to biccurim from this week's parsha, that any liquids that come from the biccurim will be like them, will be have the status of the biccurim? The Tani Reb Yossi, that Reb Yossi taught pre, that the pasuk is v'alkachta mireishis pre ha'adama. Mireishis is called pre ha'adama. Pre atamevi v'atamevi mashki. You bring fruits. Don't bring milichatchila liquids. But how do we know that if you brought grapes and you liquefied them, that they would also have the status of bikurim tamlomar tavi? It says to bring it even if they are liquefied. Okay, so therefore, just like by bikurim, the liquefied version has the status of bikurim, so also by hektish, any liquefied version would also have the status of hektish. But we can ask, bikurim are more stringent, but they require reading Arami Ovid Avi and placing down the bikurim before the mizbeach. These are things that hektish doesn't require. So maybe the liquids of maybe bikurim are more stringent because of the kriya and the anocha, and that's why its liquids are like it, but maybe not by hektish. And legomer mitruma. Rather, let's learn it out from truma. V'truma gufa minalin. How do you know that the liquids of truma are treated like truma? The issurs the bikurim. That when the pasuk says in Parshas Re'eh utrumas yadecha, we learn that trumas yadecha, truma, is actually a reference to bikurim. So therefore, truma is compared to bikurim, and we said that bikurim liquefied versions are considered like bikurim. So truma also liquefied versions are considered like truma, and we want to say that just like it's the case there, it's also the case by hektish. The Amar Mar that we said usumas yadecha elu bikurim. Ma le truma shekein chayvin aleh misa v'chomish. Yes, but truma is more stringent than hektish in that if you eat it intentionally, you chayv misa b'dei shamayim. A zar who eats it intentionally is chayv misa b'dei shamayim, and by accident has to pay back the kohen, not just the principal, but an extra fifth. So it's more stringent than hektish. Ella gomer mitarvayu mitruma v'ikurim. Well, then let's learn out from truma and bikurim, right? Maybe truma and bikurim are a little bit different, but they have a commonality, which is that their liquids are like them. Yeah, but both truma and bikurim are examples where eating them intentionally you'll be chayiv misa b'dei shamayim, and by accident an extra chomesh to be added onto the principle. Masha ain't by hektish ella aser mitruma v'chad me'anach. Rather, right, we can learn it from truma and another one mi bikurim v'chad me'anach. Meaning, for example, you can learn it out from truma and nevela. Right, so let's try to learn from truma. No, truma is more strict because there's misa and chomesh. Okay, so let's learn out them from nevela. Nevela is strict because it is lo hayashas a kosher. Right, it was always nevela from the time that it died. It was immediately by default also from the instant that it died. Masha ein kain by hektish. It was mutter until you makdish it. Okay, so then let's learn it out from bikurim or truma, whatever. So we say chozer adin. The common denominator is that their liquids are like them, whether nevela, whether truma, whether bikurim. Okay, zeh, fine. So therefore, we've learned out that when it comes to hektish, its liquid is going to be like it as well from truma / bikurim and let's say nevela. V'adetnan, that which we learned in the Mishnah and Masechta Trumis, Devash Tamarim, that when it comes to the honey of dates, so you have dates, and the honey is its liquid that comes from it. V'yain tapuchin, apple wine. V'chometz sitvanios, or vinegar made from grapes that remain on the vine during the winter, and they use those grapes for vinegar. So basically, these liquids that come from the fruit, ushar may peiris shel truma, and any other juices of truma or liquids that come, even let's say like beers and liquids that comes from truma. Rabbi Eliezer treats all these liquids no different than their solid components, right? So if you have, right, we said a date, for example. So the honey, Rabbi Eliezer treats no different than the date itself. And just like if you accidentally ate the date of truma, you'd have to pay back the kohen keren v'chomesh, the principal plus a fifth. The same thing if you ate honey of truma. Rabbi Yeshua poter, and Rabbi Yeshua says no. There would be no chomesh when it comes to the honey of dates, only for dates itself. My plige, what is the machlokus between Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua? Bedon mina umina uvdon mina vuki ba'aso. It's machlokus about how to understand. When you learn one thing from a different place, how does that exactly work? We've seen this before several times. Right? We're at the end of Shas almost. We've seen almost everything. Bedon mina umina. So like when you learn out, in this case, truma from biccurim, as we're going to see, do you learn out truma from biccurim in all elements that it'll be similar to biccurim, or do we say b'don mina vuki ba'aso, that no, you can learn out kind of the initial important step from biccurim, but the rest we are going to look internally into truma for. Let's see. Rabbi Eliezer holds don mina umina. What does that mean? Ma bikurim mashkin ayotze man kamos. And what we learned earlier, that when it comes to bikurim, because it says asher tovi, so we learned out from bikurim that in principle the liquids of bikurim are like the bikurim themselves. And because bikurim are described as trumas yadecha, so as described as truma, so truma also their liquids, the liquid of truma is like the truma itself. So av truma nami mashkin ayotze man kamosa. The liquids of truma are like the truma itself. Umina, and continued, we learn out additionally from bikurim, ma bikurim afilu shaminin. When it comes to bikurim, we're talking about all types, right, of all these species, of all the bikurim are the shiva saminim, the liquids from all shiva saminim, aminim, at least according to Rabbi Eliezer, af truma nami afilu shaminin. Rabbi Eliezer says that also when it comes to truma, all types of truma, their liquids would be like them. Whereas Rabbi Yeshua holds don mina, while we learn out from bikurim that there is a principle of liquids by truma, how, right? Ma bikurim mashkin ayotzen men kimoson av truma mashkin ayotzen men kimoson, just like by bikurim, their bikurim liquid is treated like the bikurim itself. Same thing by the truma. However, v'uki ba'asra, in terms of which fruits, when it comes to truma, are their liquids in fact like them? Well, for that we look internally to truma. Mashkin de kachim betruma tirosh v'yitzar. It says explicitly by truma tirosh and yitzar. What does the pasuk say? The pasuk says, I'm reading you a pasuk that isn't in the Gemara. Kol chelev yitzar v'chol chelev tirosh v'dagon reishis mashet yidnu l'chanas hatim. So it says specifically yitzar, which is oil, and tirosh, which is wine. So we specify by truma, wine, and oil. So specifically those liquids would be considered like truma itself. However, midach lo, if you have dates, for example, date honey would not be considered truma. So af mashkin ayotzin mehen ke mosan tirosh v'yitzar in midei achrine lo. Okay, so therefore, according to Rabbi Yeshua, only wine and olive oil would be considered having the status of truma, whereas any other liquid would not have a status of truma, and you would not be chayiv a chomesh if you accidentally consumed it. But the time that which we learn in a Mishnah, also in Masechta Trumas, the very next Mishnah. Right, we had learned before, I believe, Perek Yud Beis, Perek Yud Aleph, Mishnah Beis. Now we're learning Perek Yud Aleph, Mishnah Gimel, where it says, in Mavin Bikurim, Mashke, that we don't bring Bikurim as Mashke. Elayotzim and Azesim Umina Anovim. That when it comes to Bikurim, so when we say that Bikurim can be brought even as liquids, that's specifically wine and olive oil. Mani, who is that? Like Rabbi Yeshua? It's like Rabbi Yeshua. The Amri says, Don mina vuki be'asra. V'gamar lebikurim mi truma. Fine. That according to Rabbi Yeshua, he says, look, all we know from Parshas Kisava when it says Asher Tovi, we know that when it comes to bikurim, you are allowed to bring right. But what the liquid of the biccurim would be treated like the biccurim. But which of the Shiva Saminim, which of the 7 species that are brought as bikurim does this apply to? We say, well, bikurim is compared to truma. By truma, it says wine and olive oil. So therefore, we will say that is what it is referring to, just wine and olive oil. Veha ditnan. Ein sofkenes or arboy mishum orla elal yotze min azesum min ha'anovim money. When it says also in that Mishnah Masechta Trumas that when it comes to orla, if one were to eat the fruit of a tree within the first 3 years and was warned, they would get makis, but only only for that which comes from olives and grapes, meaning that you'd be chayav makis for orla if you consume the liquids only of olives and grapes, i.e. olive oil and wine. Money, who is that? Rabbi Shuhi. It is Rabbi Shuhi the Omer don mina v'uki be'asra v'gamilu lebikurim mitruma, that he learns bikurim from truma, right? The be'etzem, we learned that by bikurim, it applies, right? The liquids are like it, but then we learn that when it comes to truma, however, it says specific, right? So we learn truma also, its liquids are considered truma, but it's specific to tirosh and yitzar, to olive oil and wine, which we then learn back to bikurim, that bikurim is only by olive oil and wine, but the maisila, the orla pre mi bikurim, and it says ve'araltam orla, so espirio by orla, and it says by bikurim, reish is called pri or adama, so we learn out the gzera shava to say that by orla also it is limited only to wine and oil. Friends, that was daf kuf chav, daf 120 of Masechta Chullin. Daf kuf chav Masechta Chullin was kind of big and got a little bit, it got big and kind of technical, but anyways, the first section we're talking about hair as a handle or a guard. We said, well, if there are multiple hairs, well, then for sure it could be a handle, a yad. And if there was only one hair, then maybe it's possibly a machlokas. Gravy, what is rotev? We said it could be, Rava said it's fat. Abai is some kind of gooky stuff that comes from the meat. Sediment, what's kipo? What's sediment? Well, it could actually literally be sediment at the bottom of the pot, or it could be spices. We then started talking about liquified issurs, for example, liquified nevela, liquified chometz, liquified cheleb. These are all things that you would be chayiv even in liquified form, because it says nefesh, anything that relieves one's soul, you would be chayiv for. Then we talked about liquified bikurim. We talked all about that according to Yeshua, it would be specifically liquified wine and oil, whereas according to Rabbi Eliezer, it would be even any liquified bikurim would still be considered bikurim. We talked about that in terms of truma as well, at the very end in terms of orla. Friends, that was Daf Kuf Chof of Masechta Chullin. Hope you enjoyed. Have a great day and a great Shabbos. Cheers.